Hello, welcome to the 2020 Environmental Ethics Symposium. I'm Maria Blevins, a professor in the Communication Department at Utah Valley University, and I'm honored to be here with Dr. Bretz, who's a professor of environmental philosophy at Utah Valley University in the Philosophy and Humanities Department. He's also the co-director of the Environmental Studies minor here at UVU. So in this series, we're highlighting UVU community members and how environmental ethics figures into their teaching, their research, and their lives. And so we're so lucky to get to have this conversation today. Dr. Bretz, how did you first become interested in philosophy in general and environmental philosophy in particular?
That's a really good question, and I think it's, I don't know, maybe due to the pondering nature of philosophy, one that I've asked myself, I think, throughout my life. So I think the story that I kind of somewhat settled on in the end is I think that I'm one of those cases where you're already doing the thing when you're young, and then later you find out there's a name for it. So, I feel like that I've kind of always asked these kind of philosophical questions, and I guess most children do. But I think in my case, maybe my dad was largely responsible for, having the patience to engage some of these questions with me. Like, and often had to do, I don't know, with, the nature of like free will, or, the nature of God, or what morality is, or things like that. And so I kept thinking about that. And then I think in high school, I also was fortunate that I had a few friends who also were kind of interested in some of these questions. And I think specifically, I always had some friends that, who politically disagreed with me. And I feel like there was always this wall that I hit where I couldn't quite figure out why we disagreed, right? There was like, we gave our reasons, but it often was just stuff we heard at home, read in the newspapers, but then we never could really get to the bottom of the disagreement. And I think that was part of, I think, what motivated me, understanding reasons and disagreement. And then, in college, I studied history and philosophy, and I was actually mostly interested in history, and philosophy was interesting, but it wasn't kind of my main area. But then when I came to the US, I studied in the New School in New York for a while for my master's. I think that was when I actually got both more into philosophy and environmental philosophy, because they didn't have a history department, but they had a really nice philosophy department. So I studied there for 2 years, and then until that point, I'd mostly just studied philosophy in the way of like, well, I'm just going to study everything that's out there, and I didn't have like a specific area that interested me. And then towards the end of my time there was this one philosopher, French philosopher, Jacques Derrida, who just published a book on animals. And I read that and I was like, well, it occurred to me that maybe I could just study things that I really care about personally. And so at the time I had already been vegetarian. And so I was like, well, I want to, study animals. And then I started thinking about animals. And then I realized, that there's this kind of whole further world of just thinking about relationships between humans and non-humans. And I figured out, well, some of these questions raise broader questions, right? About the whole, relationship between humans and nature, and how we think about nature and non-humans. And so that is, how I think how I got into environmental philosophy. And then I studied that for a few years. And then I was, very lucky to actually get a job as an environmental philosopher. And here we are.
Awesome. What a great story. What does environmental ethics mean to you?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I guess like there are usually, I think, three ways in which I think about it, and that's also sometimes how I introduce it. I think when I teach environmental ethics, so I think there are kind of three different ways. One is, I think the first is maybe the classical way that most people think about it, and that is that it has to do with the relationships, moral relationships between humans and non-humans. So like humans and animals, humans and plants, human and ecosystems, or human nature more generally. And I think that is kind of how a lot of people think about it. But then there's, I think, a second way to think about it, and that's maybe most prevalent in environmental justice, namely that it has to do with ethical relationships between people as mediated through the environment. And I think that view already, I think, is somewhat different in the sense that it doesn't presuppose this strict human nature distinction, that you find, I think, in the first view very often. And I think that maybe relates to a third view that I think is prevalent, I think, in some indigenous outlooks, but I think also in some of the kind of earlier work in the 20th century in environmentalism, for example, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, where there's really this kind of complete intertwinement of ourselves with the environment. And so that environmental ethics, in a sense, would be about recognizing all these relationships of interdependence, and then actually asking, well, given that we can't get out of these relationships, how do we actually, to use an indigenous phrase, make sure that we are in good relations, with all these others, non-human or human. And so I think that is, a view that I find very attractive. I think a thing that I really like about environmental ethics philosophically is that you can really go to almost any question from environmental ethical questions, because they're so broad, and they concern, I think, the entire way that kind of we, quote unquote, in the kind of Euro descendant West have thought about the world. Like, they raise fundamental questions about the nature of reality, of morality, of, what it means to be a moral agent, things like that. So it's a very rich field, and you kind of can get almost anywhere from it. And maybe one last thing that I think about when I think about environmental ethics is that for me, I think ethics is never about finding these kind of eternal principles that are valid, at all places or at all times, but it usually reflects the interests and commitments of a given community or society, right? What is kind of important for a given community at the time. So I think against that backdrop, I think the fact that I think it was in the 1970s that the first class titled environmental ethics was actually taught in the United States. And I think sometimes people read that story and think, oh, we finally start to care about the environment. But I think, right, people have always in some ways cared about the environment. I think that is nothing new. Maybe I think what is new is that we live in a civilization that really, has kind of not cared for the environment at all for very long. So I think maybe the emergence of environmental ethics and sustainability and kind of all this concern is really more reflective of how bad we've been at this as a civilization, and that finally I think people were like, okay, we need to think about this, and why are we so bad at this, and can't we actually be better at relating to the environment. So yeah, I think these are some of the ways in which I think about it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. You talked about Derrida and his work about animals being something that really triggered your interest in environmental philosophy. Could you tell us about the thinkers or the books on this subject that are particularly dear to you?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and it's funny that you kind of mentioned Derrida as a segue, because I feel like I don't know, maybe that's true for everyone, who wrote a dissertation about something, that you have kind of a love-hate relationship, to the thinkers or
Yeah.
the theories or the themes that you write on for your dissertation. Because I think Derrida definitely has influenced me a lot, but I also find him very, I don't know, obnoxious, I guess, is maybe the right word at times. And I'm still not sure, yeah, whether he could have written what he wrote in a in an easier way. I mean, yeah, if people know anything about Derrida, he's very difficult to read. But maybe that's why some of my favorite books are, I think, written in a very different style. I think like one book that I always recommend to people, and I've recommended to a lot of my students, is Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. So she's not exactly a philosopher, although I think there are a lot of philosophical themes in the book. And she's a very interesting thinker and a beautiful writer. She's Potawatomi indigenous, and she's a plant biologist. And I think like sometimes I teach chapters from this book, and I've never failed to get like a really interesting discussion out of it, because it's a really, I guess, like you could say, optimistic, but not in a kind of naive sense where we just assume everything will be fine. But I think she's very optimistic about the human abilities to actually build positive relationships with the non-human world. And she describes, I think, these possibilities in kind of very vivid terms. Maybe in line with that, I've also started recently to read more poetry, maybe to balance out, kind of the stress that comes from reading about climate change or some of these other things. After she became the U.S. Poet Laureate, I started to look into Joy Harjo's work, and I think I find her poetry really beautiful. I think Mary Oliver similarly, because she also has a very, I think, optimistic tone, even though I think she knows the world is not always a nice place. And then maybe kind of two other books if people want to check those out. I think one really nice book about climate change that sums up, I think, very well the philosophical debate on it is Dale Jameson, Reason in a Dark Time. And I think that actually complements very well with Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark. Because maybe when you read Jameson, you're going to feel a little down afterwards. And I think reading Solnit afterwards, actually finding hope in these dark times, I think is a nice complement to that. Yeah, these are some of the authors I think that I kind of really like.
That's great. What's it like to teach environmental ethics here at Utah Valley University?
It's, I mean, basically it's great. It's also very interesting and, I think in kind of positive ways challenging. Actually, I guess my kind of predecessor, the late David Keller, who used to teach environmental ethics at UVU, he actually wrote, I think, a short article about this, what it's like to teach environmental ethics in a place that isn't known to be particularly, like open towards, that kind of outlook. And, I think, like, of course, Utah, I mean, every place is complex, right? But overall, you can say that Utah isn't exactly known to be very environmentalist, even though I think, it has beautiful landscapes. I think there is a lot of love of, like home in some way. So I think love of the landscape in some way, but that doesn't always translate into environmental action, right? I think there was a study last year that I think Provo has the highest carbon footprint per household in the nation. But I think precisely because of that, I find that I think almost all my students, without exceptions, are very eager to actually talk about those things. Because, I think they do, right? We all have an environment, right? On some level, you can't escape it. And so I think it's one of those things that maybe the culture at large doesn't give them a lot of opportunity to talk about. So I think when there's an opportunity to talk about it carefully, I think they really jump on it and really, I think are willing to have really difficult and interesting conversations about it. So I think it's really great. I would also maybe say one last thing about the teaching. I think, teaching, especially in a predominantly conservative state, I think there's this interesting revelation, I think, that some of my conservative students, have when I think it turns out that you really can be politically conservative and care about the environment, right? That there is this kind of narrative, I think, that started around the 1980s. And before that, I think conservatives often were environmentalists. But then around the 1980s, there was this narrative that you couldn't be conservative and an environmentalist. And, a friend of mine, once told me that conservation and conservative are only separated by two letters, the wise Maria Blevins. And, I think that's really true. And I had one student, for example, he thanked me after class when we talked about this. And I think it's kind of a shame that, we have that narrative because, some of the traditional concerns of conservative politics, like local autonomy or even things like private property, I think they can be squared very well with environmental concerns, which, of course, doesn't mean that other political outlooks, shouldn't be linked to environmentalism. But I think that is something that I find very interesting to engage with the full complexity of the people we have in our classes and everything they actually bring to our classes. So, yeah.
Yeah, you eloquently said that. I think it's such a privilege and such an interesting place to teach. Tell me a little bit about your research and what you're working on right now.
So I've thought a lot about what it is that kind of connects all my research because I feel like so there's some people, right, just like there are people who have already known when they were 5 years old what they want to do, with their, job wise. I think there are also some people that kind of have their research project and they know that's their research project and that's what they do. So I feel like I never was quite like that, right? I feel like that I kind of jump back and forth between different things. But I thought about what is kind of the thing that ties it all together. And I think it's a concern with thinking about like ethical systems, normative systems, but maybe also political systems that actually are more inclusive, especially towards non-human beings, but in a way that doesn't, in a sense, trade off that exclusion by excluding others, right? And I mean, an example of that, like a paper that I wrote that I hope will come out this fall, looked at a kind of point of contention between environmental justice discourses and disability studies. And so one thing that I noticed, right, when you read a lot of environmental justice literature, you often encounter disability as a kind of shorthand for harm or for something bad that happened or an injustice. Whereas if you read if you read disability studies, academics or activists, I think you notice that is a view that is, like widely rejected, in those circles, that basically disability shouldn't be seen as automatically harmful or worse, than being non-disabled. And so in that paper, I basically try to show that we can really still ask, make all the demands of environmental justice, that we want without actually assuming that disability is bad in itself, right? I think by drawing on other kinds of harms that, I think are unequivocally harms, like, for example, like death or things like that, but also infringement of autonomy, you can basically get the same results without actually, perpetuating these kind of ableist assumptions. So I think that is kind of one example of this. And then a paper I'm working on right now, and I'm still kind of trying to figure out the exact angle, but it's again trying to analyze a conflict specifically between vegan and kind of animal rights outlooks and food sovereignty discourses. And I think the conflict here comes from the idea that I think most vegans take their position to in some way be morally universal, right? Of course they mostly, admit that, well, some people might not be able to be vegan for health reasons, some people might not be able to afford vegan food, etc., etc. But overall, they say, in an ideal world, everyone would be morally required to be vegan, right? And then on the other hand, you have food sovereignty advocates who, especially I'm thinking about indigenous food sovereignty advocates who really, I think, defend this idea that communities should have autonomy over the way that they distribute, produce, and consume food. And for example, if that means that, say, the Inuit want to hunt seals or whales, or that, the Makah want to hunt whales, that should be possible, and that, in some way there shouldn't be any kind of intervention. And so I'm trying to basically suggest in the end, I think what I end up with is that I basically say that veganism doesn't have a moral basis to actually claim that, their views are valid in these other contexts. And I think that has to do with the way that I think that moral claims derive their validity from a specific social context. So I do think that vegan arguments, for example, in the kind of, Euro-dominant societies, that we live in, are very strong, as arguments. But if you take them out of those contexts, you kind of don't have a leg to stand on. And then you have to really do the work of engaging very carefully with these discourses. Right. And of course, that doesn't mean that you couldn't be indigenous and vegan, right? There are some indigenous writers, kind of argue for it, but you need to do the work to then actually, argue from that other perspective. So yeah, I think these are kind of two projects. And then, one other thing that I'm working on and have been working on for a while is a book project. At least I hope it'll be a book project in the end. But in a nutshell, it kind of explores on what basis or on what experiential basis, right, we actually can experience non-humans as persons. So sometimes that's referred to as animism, right? But basically, what is it about human experience that allows certain cultures to develop these normative systems that include, not just animals, but also plants, and then also, environmental systems like rivers or mountains or things like that. And so I think in the end, I end up with some kind of view, that argues that I think what we take to be morally relevant in our lives has less to do with what qualities the beings around us have, are they conscious, are they sentient, things like that, but has more to do with what kinds of relationships we have with these beings, and, whether they're relationships of interdependence and, reciprocity, and that often plausibly carries, normative demands. So I think these are kind of the main thing I'm working on right now. And yeah, as I said, I think it all has to do with building inclusive systems without leaving anyone out, I guess.
Cool. I like what your brain's up to. Those are interesting things to think about.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you want to say about environmental ethics that I haven't asked you at this point?
Well, maybe just one thing that I think I first noticed when I taught a climate change class a couple of years back, and I think we hinted at this before in our conversation, but sometimes, right, talking about environmental stuff can really bum people out. I think to the point where they get like almost where they can get almost paralyzed, right, and get like very sad. And I noticed that when I taught climate change and I struggled with it, and it really I think made me think much harder about, well, what is it that I'm, as a teacher, what is it that I want to actually offer the people in my class, right? And I think it needs to be more than just dumping a bunch of horrible stuff on them and then just letting them sort it out somehow. So I think since then I've thought more about assigning readings or podcasts or things like that that are talk more about not just solutions, right, but also how can we actually look at the world as it is, right, with all its kind of faults and problems, but not become desperate and kind of not lose hope. And I found this kind of idea of a kind of perpetual or constant struggle. I think is sometimes helpful. I think I think for example Angela Davis coined this term of a constant struggle. And there's also I think a more recent article by I think Catherine Norlock that is called For Perpetual Struggle. But the idea is, right, that in some way we need to accept that we're never going to be done, right? As long as there are human communities, there's going to be issues, that we face in some ways. And it's not up to us to solve kind of the world, right? Like it's really just we're members of communities and, we do what we can, but it's really, I think, it's really not, I think, right to think that in some way we can once and for all solve the problem of living together, right, as humans and also with non-humans. And I think that is somewhat helpful that you don't need to carry the weight of the world on your individual shoulders. You do what you can, and then the next generation will do their next thing, and so we'll continue. And that's part of, I guess, the human story in some ways. But yeah, I think it's the main thing that I'm always working through with students, and it's something I'm struggling with myself, right? I think it's a question maybe for all of us who work on these issues. How do we stay true to looking at the world as it is, but also remain, hopeful and remain actually engaged, in some way.
Yeah, doing that with like a little joy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really interesting conversation.